After Jesus' baptism, he was led to the wilderness, where he wrestled with faith and doubt. Mark says he was tempted by Satan, which is an interesting understanding because Clarence Jordan in The Substance of Faith suggests that Satan's role was to confuse humanity. Writing, the word Mark used was diablos, which originates from the words dia, meaning around or through, and balo, meaning to throw. Therefore, diablos means one who throws things about or stirs things up to get them confused. The work of Satan, then, is to get us muddled or to mislead us. And in the first chapter of Mark, the great confuser tests Jesus for 40 days to knock him off track and tempt him into avoiding the path of the cross. Instead of suffering, he is tempted to take an easier path, a path of power, and a nihilistic path that believes humanity has no value. Jesus was driven into the wilderness to wrestle spiritually and physically with himself and the great confuser who approached Jesus saying, "If you are the anointed one, the chosen of Israel, then take power." Jesus was tempted to rule the people and lord over them using food as a weapon. He's told to turn stones into bread and feed it to the people. Then with their stomachs nearly full, they will desire more. And Jesus will gain authority because hungry people will do anything for food, even become puppets on a string. Limit their access to food and they will do your bidding because you can keep them fed. And when they refuse to obey your orders, you can starve them into submission. You can exercise great power and influence over those who have no food, and they will happily beat their plowshares into swords for you. And they will obey your instructions and recognize your ultimate authority, for you will be the bread Messiah. And then Jesus was seduced with military power. He was taken to a great height and shown all the kingdoms of the world and told that he could be a reckless megalomaniac with no moral scruples, and he could rule with an iron fist. He could rule the world using fear. He could display his power by destroying his enemies, by calling on holy airstrikes of fiery meteorites. And Jesus, when tempted by the great power he could wield, he could destroy Israel's enemies and target anyone who challenged or questioned him with real muscle and a warped sense of justice. The great confuser tempted Jesus with these alternatives, highlighting that this is how the real world operated. Suffering love makes for great feel-good messages, and what's practiced in heaven and will possibly operate on earth one day, but ruthless power and order through violence is how the real world operates. Anything else, like the suffering of the cross, is just plain foolishness. This is a similar concern echoed by Simon Peter after Jesus informed him that the path of discipleship is suffering. It's possible that this scene reveals that Jesus wasn't the only one tested by the great confuser. So were Jesus' followers. Peter was tested, and he rejected Jesus' challenge. Jesus' news was unexpected, unbelievable, and unacceptable. Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, a phrase that Mark typically reserved for Jesus when he silenced demons. And Jesus responded by rebuking Peter with the words, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but human things." With these words, Jesus made his position clear. He will go into Jerusalem and will offer people hope, and he will show people a new way to God. But to do so, he will have to struggle. He'll have to enter the wilderness, encounter trouble that people experience, and will do what they will with him. For us, he says, you cannot be comfortable and you cannot rest. You must be willing to enter the harsh conditions that people will endure, and you cannot quit. Which was the third test Jesus endured while he was in the wilderness. The great confuser tempted Jesus with resignation, saying that humanity is beyond help. Instead of suffering for humanity and suffering humiliation and pain, Jesus should just call it quits. Why stay in this desert, in this barren land of blowing sandy winds and high desert temperatures that rob you of your breath? Why not succumb to your misery, your hunger pains, and your isolation, and just lie down and die? Just give up. Just quit. Lately, I've pondered this final test that Jesus faced and the temptation he wrestled with as he tried to remain focused on his mission while also seeing hopeless situations around him. During the time in the wilderness, Jesus was determined to devote his body, his mind, and his spirit to the work God called him to do, and he challenged us to do the same. But it's difficult to follow his instructions when our minds are mired down by worldly things that truly appear hopeless. It's difficult to set our minds on divine things while our minds are distracted by difficulties and concerns about our health and well-being. It's hard to focus on God. We are consumed by financial worries and struggles, and yes, even flooding basements. It's tough to have hope worrying about the current flu epidemic or a pending result of a cancer test or the recent violence in our schools. These things occupy our minds, and they tempt us to just give up, to lie down and just let the world move on down this hopeless path. Or perhaps with reports of violence, we've become numb to these horrible, hopeless things, and we're tempted to not just care anymore, to go on the offensive. Maybe like Jesus in the wilderness, we just see sand everywhere. Maybe it beats on our skin like needles. But sometimes, as author Himley Heath wrote, sometimes it takes getting lost in the wilderness before we find the beauty in front of us. This is what Mario Prosperi, an Italian runner, discovered when he got lost in the Sahara Desert. Mario was an Italian police officer, and he loved running. He had competed in many marathons, running on mountains and glaciers. So when he heard about a grueling 6-day, 155-mile foot race through the Saharan Desert in Morocco, he was thrilled to enter the competition. On day 3 of the race, he held 4th place out of 80 runners. That night, as he went to bed, he felt confident about his chances to win the competition. On the 4th day, he was surprised as he passed through 4 checkpoints in first place. And then everything went wrong. As he entered the sand dunes portion of the race, a violent sandstorm kicked in with terrifying fury. He was quickly swallowed by a yellow wall of sand. Blinded, he struggled to breathe. The sand whipped his face like a storm of needles. Disoriented, he kept moving just to avoid being buried by the sand. Finally, he found a location that provided relative shelter, and he crouched into the area and pulled his scarf around his face to avoid wounds from the sharp sand. Finally, 8 hours later, the wind ceased blowing and it was dark. So he slept among the sand dunes. In the morning, he woke to discover a transformed landscape that waited for him. Thankfully, though, he had a compass and a map, but without a point of reference, he wasn't sure where on the map he should even begin. After 4 hours of running and walking, he finally realized he was lost. But he kept walking. He kept walking because he hoped someone would find him or he would find them. After a couple of days of walking, he thought he found a sign of hope, a shrine. But it turned out the shrine was deserted, and so he was defeated, thirsty, hungry, tired, and powerless. He was hopeless, and he sat down and wrote a goodbye letter to his wife. Then he sat in the doorway of the shrine, staring at the empty desert. He gave up hope, and he simply lay down to die. In the morning, after he realized he hadn't died, he stood up. Realizing that God had spared his life, he set out once more walking when he stumbled onto a fresh footprint in the sand. Then he found additional footprints, and he followed them to a village where they recognized him as the lost runner who had been lost for 10 days. Then he was taken to hospital and treated for his wounds. But in this story, as I was reading this and those footprints, it reminded me of the conclusion of the poem, Footprints in the Sand, when it says, "My precious child, I love you and I will never leave you. Never, never during your trials and restings, when you saw only one set of footprints, It was then that I carried you. The footprints in the Saharan desert were a sign of hope, a sign to keep walking, to keep moving forward, because just beyond the next sand dune was hope. 4 years later, Mario returned to race once again, this time crossing the finish line. But it's a sign for us that we cannot give up. We must keep moving forward. And I relate Mario's experience to our own Lenten journey. During Lent, we are encouraged to examine and reorient ourselves to seek a higher vision. And though we may be worn with family struggles, the violence, personal pain, and worries, we are encouraged not to quit, especially when the adversity of addictions, desperation, fear, pride, hatred, anger, or insecurity attempt to confuse or distract us from setting our minds on worldly things instead of divine things. And Jesus encouraged us to not let the great confuser discourage us during our time of suffering. Jesus said, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and so must those who follow him." To be sure, this is not to say that we should intentionally suffer or seek it for ourselves, nor overlook it in others. But we shouldn't run away from it either. And we shouldn't just lie down and die. Suffering can teach us empathy, sympathy, and compassion. And there are some kinds of suffering that can produce good. And I encourage us that utilizing the season of Lent, though we may be surrounded by tall walls of painful blowing sand that beat against our face, we can reorient ourselves to find God in our lives. And we can reach out to those who are suffering as well. And together, we can walk together. Perhaps we are called to go farther into the wilderness. And maybe we will become even more lost than ever before. Yet, we are invited into the suffering. Pope Benedict said, "There is no love without suffering." Jesus illustrated that his life of loving was visible through suffering. And he called to the crowd and his disciples, saying, "If you want to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Our struggle is not to go on the offensive. Our struggle is involving both loving and suffering. Yet if we set our minds on the things of God, then we can walk together with those who are tempted and troubled. And we can walk toward that sand dune that has hope just on the other side. On the other side of these troubles and suffering is hope. And as we walk and embrace each other through these times, we can keep walking so that we're not buried. Jesus delivered us hope, and he promised he remains with us, especially in these times of trouble. He says, "I will never abandon you. I will never leave you forsaken." During this season of Lent, let's not forget that our deepest conviction comes out of the experience of spiritual wrestling and endurance, which leads us toward hope. And it lies just ahead.